I do want to apologize about the noise. It is an active printing shop, so there's going to be noise. I will try my best to fix it in post-production, but it is what it is. Okay. So, welcome to a special episode of the Crypto Comic Studio, where we're actually on location here at Falls Printing with Jim Donovan. You've been in the printing game forever.
My entire life. It's all I've ever done. It's all I know how to do. Offset printing, in particular, the way you would print comic books is what I've been into my whole life. So,
Okay.
yep.
So, how did you get into it?
Well, the way I got into it is I got out of high school and I was going to go to college. I went to Penn State for a semester and I thought, this is just not for me. I just can't do it. Just can't sit. So what I did was my dad had been in printing. He was in printing his entire life, working for Westinghouse Printing, which at the time was the largest company in the world. He asked, would you like to try printing? I said, sure, I'll give it a shot. So I had what was called an apprenticeship. So literally for an entire year, I worked in a shop from the time a job came in the door till it went out the door. So I wrote up the job ticket, I planned it, I ordered the paper, I did all the negatives on it, I shot all the negatives, I assembled all the film, I made all the plates, I actually printed it on a press, folded it, everything beginning to end. So I learned the entire printing process over a year. So I went to work every day, 8 to 5, and didn't get paid. And I thought those guys just wanted me to do their work for them, but they were teaching me. I was young and didn't realize. I took to what is called pre-press right away. So what pre-press is I used to make film, plates, I did color correction, just about every facet.
Now, you did this all before computers, really?
All
Infiltrated
before
printing,
computers,
so,
yes. Every bit of it before computers, before Macintoshes. So it was all on film. Everything had to be done with film.
So, do you have any that we can see?
Any film?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have some. We have some film over here. So the way we used to do things, what Matthew does now on a computer, he would have done on a sheet of paper like this. Take actual pieces of art, position them, make sure they're straight, make sure they're square. So he would have one of those for each page. This was a cookbook that we did years and years ago. I would shoot the negative of this page. So just one page, I'd shoot the negative of it. The next one, the next one, the next one. So all these pieces of film. Then I would have to draw up a layout. How it's actually going to be laid out on press. So what this orange mask sheet represents my layout. So
that's one sheet of aluminum.
this is one sheet of aluminum. This is one signature. So everything's printed flat on a flat sheet of paper. So what I had to do back then, first thing I would do is I would split the sheet in half, and then I would start measuring. I would put gutters in there. I would put these different marks in there. And so I would draw in exactly where that page is going to go. Then I would have to physically, kind of see the image there. I would have to physically, on a light table, take these pages, you could see through it on a light table. I could see right through this orange mask. And I would have to physically line up every single individual page. They had to be perfectly square. I had to tape them all into position. And I had to make sure the pagination was right on everything.
So, what are these marks that you have on there?
These marks, this is opaque. So when we used to shoot film, there would be dust in the air, little particles would get on pieces of film, so it would leave little flaws and little holes. The glass must have been real dirty when we shot this one, because there's a whole bunch of stuff that needed taken out. What that opaque was, it was just clay, and it wouldn't let light through. So
Okay.
all of these pages had to be, I had to make sure I had the heads go in the correct direction. I had to make sure they were in the right spot by a folding dummy each time. And then
So what order do those actually go in when you're actually laying them out?
when I'm actually laying them out, okay, so when I would burn a plate, okay, like our plate burner in there, I would lay the plate down, so the plate would be first, okay, then I would lay this negative down on top of the plate, and then, see, the problem is, see all of this stuff?
Yes.
It would burn, it would come through. You would have all these big black marks everywhere. So we would make what was called a mask. So this would go down on the plate. This mask would go over top of that. And it just cleaned everything up. So all of these gutters, all of this stuff that I had to physically cut and tape and position in here, all gets masked out. So all we see, all the images to the plate, is the image that we want.
So how did you go from the negatives to the plate?
On a plate burner, so it was like science fiction. It was a vacuum frame. You know what a vacuum frame is. Same thing you use now as a vacuum frame. I would put the plate in and I would lay these things on there. The vacuum frame would come up. It would suck all the air out, would make sure there was no air bubbles. Then there was a table, we would actually flip the entire table over that this was on, so this would get flipped upside down. Then underneath the machine, there were actually, I used several kinds. I actually used an old kind that used welding rods. Newark was the name of the machine, and literally, I would hit the button, and literally 2 welding rods, it would be glowing like something out of a Frankenstein movie. So that image, that super halide light, would expose the plate. Then we would take the plate and we would develop it. So it was actually like science fiction. There would be smoke and all kind of crap coming off the machine. We used to have to clean the glass all the time. Other ones I used, they were lights from up top. They were high pressure sodium lights, sodium halide lights, super bright, enough that can expose film and expose plates. So I used several different kinds of those plate burners is what they called them, and they were literally burners. I mean, they would literally burn. There would be smoke everywhere, and that's how they would get on there. So the reason stuff has to be divisible by 4 has everything to do with the way your publications are put together. So I'm guessing all of your comic books are saddle stitched.
Yes. That's the 2 staples.
So the reason you have to have the 4 pages is the way it's bound, the way it's put together. If you have a magazine like this is perfect bind. There's no staples versus there is staples in this one. Okay? So the difference is when we are printing a magazine, when we are printing something that's saddle stitch, it goes onto a collator and a machine. We fold the paper down in the right order in the images, so I have to have 4. You have to have 4 pages
facing each other.
So it can bind correctly, so it can go through the binder correctly. If you have a perfect bind book, you can use individual pages. You guys have to do 4 pages just simply because of the way everything is printed on a flat sheet. So everything's printed, all your magazines, all your comics are printed on a flat sheet, and then they get folded. So they'll get folded down, and they go through a collator, and they stack on top of each other. If you just had 2 pages like this, so this is a 4-pager, right? We do 4-pagers. You can do a 4-pager. Can't do 2 pages. There's no way to bind it. There's no way to. So the whole reason you have to have 4 pages is the way it's put together, the way it's bound. If you had a spiral bound, you've seen spiral bound things, you can make those any amount you want.
because you're not dependent on the folding.
Well, they would still need to at least be divisible by 2 at that point.
Yeah, they're divisible by 2, right? Or you'd have a blank page, like
Yeah.
you were saying. You know, some of your guys come back, they'll get a proof that has 3 blank pages because they have an extra. So 4, 4, 4, always 4, always 4. And when you're doing comics, especially or anything, when you're binding stuff like this, always work backwards. So what is your end result? How many pages is your magazine? That's the first thing you should do. Instead of worrying about it when you get a proof back and you have 3 blank pages, then you have to add pages, you have to get rid of pages to make it work. So make sure you're starting in 4. Just always go in 4 and you're never going to have a problem if you're saddle stitching.
So we always went with a standard start with a 4, figure out your page count, figure out how many pages for ads, and then that allows you to figure out, okay, I can tell the story this many pages.
And that many pages, right? You have this amount of stuff to fill, yep. But if you do by 4, then you're always going to be good. You're always going to be able to do stuff by 4. Anything less than that, there's going to be problems. You're going to have to add or going to have to subtract.
Okay.
And it's just a function of the bindery itself, the way the magazines are actually put together is the reason why. On these big flat sheets. So if you have a 32-page comic book, this is 16 pages. There's 8 on the front and there's 8 on the back. So this thing's gonna fold up like this. And so you have 16 of your 32 pages here. Another sheet is gonna have the other 16 pages on it. We can't print 32 at a time, we have to do 16 and 16.
So would it go the outside on one and then the inside ones on the other one?
Outside.
132, you know, that.
Well, it depends on the folding dummy.
Okay.
Yeah, it depends all on the folding dummy, how we do the folding. So the best advice I can give you, a gutter. Y'all know what gutters are in your magazines, right? Do not run type across your gutter Okay, here's a good example.
yeah.
Here's a good example right here. So what happens is, so your first signature is printed, your second signature is printed. They're both folded. Now they have to be put together. So now they have to be put together on a different machine. So if you open this up and you have type running like this, you have 2 different machines, 2 different moving parts trying to line something up dead on. See how there's a little gap there? Sometimes you'll see in a gutter, they might be uneven. The type might be up high, it might be down lower, and that's the reason is it's on 2 different signatures. It's on 2 different pieces that are getting put together. So what you want to do, anytime you're designing and you have type or anything that's crucial that lines up, you want to keep the type out of the gutter as much as possible. So what they could have done here, I mean, just looking at it real quick, you could move this down here, you could move this over to get that type out of the gutter. If you're gonna run type in a gutter, run it in the gutter.
So between the letters.
Don't do a quarter of a letter like that, because the pressman screams at me, the bindery screams at me. Why are they doing that like that? I've told you about that 50 times. I said I've told them all 50 times, and they don't get it. But that's why. So keep as much out of this gutter as possible as far as crossover stuff. If you have type, split the type with it. Put it between the H and the O. Don't take that much of the O. Because there's a good chance that thing's not going to line up. That's why you keep things out of gutter. That one's a little better, but that's a center. So this doesn't matter. It's a center
Yeah, that's
spread.
the very middle.
Center spread never matters. You're always going to be fine with that center spread. It's just when it hits on other pages that it becomes a problem. So, there we go.
Okay.
When I started in printing, after my apprenticeship, I just got the first job that came along. I got hired right away. It was for a newspaper plant. So I worked for the newspaper plant. I went in and they started me in the press room. So it was called a fly boy. So I just did all of the grunt work for the pressman. I would load paper, just do all kind of stuff, catch them when they came off the end of the press, all of those things. Printers were brutal back then. If you made a mistake, your boss got in your face and MF'd you like there was no tomorrow. This was before discrimination, before any of that stuff. If you screwed up, you were told about it. So, that was my second day on the job, because that's why you said it. So I was working on a press with the press room supervisor, who was notoriously mean. The guy was just mean. That's all there was to it. Never said a word to anybody, but he was a perfectionist. He was a phenomenal pressman. So the second day I was working there, he had me do what's called time the units. It's complicated, but I had to roll a press cylinder back, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. So I messed it up. So he started it up, and he's like, wait a minute, this is all off. Something's wrong. So we went back, and he saw that I hadn't timed it right. I hadn't timed the cylinder right. And he says, did you mess this up? And I said, well, I did what I thought I was supposed to do. He looked at me and says, how long have you been here? And I said, well, it's my second day. He said, you're a rookie for one day. You get 1 day. After that, you're not a rookie. So I just shut up, did what I was told, worked a couple more days. I was working with that same supervisor, and I was looking at the paper we were doing. I had all this pre-press experience that he didn't know about. I looked at the paper and I said, this halftone looks like this is terrible. He looked at me and said, can you do any better? I said, yeah. Here I am, all of 20 years old, telling this 60-year-old pressman what to do. And he says, all right. I said, okay, smart ass. When you come in tomorrow, go into pre-press. Go into the camera room. Shoot halftones. I did. They looked fantastic, much better than what they were getting. So that's how I ended up in pre-press, and I've stayed there ever since. Absolutely love it. I've never worked a day in my life. That's how we did. That's how I got into pre-press.
Yeah, you know more about color. You've probably forgotten more about color than I've ever learned through college and everything like that. Yeah. Can you, I guess, kind of explain to me the difference between the RGB, CMYK, with LAB, that kind of stuff?
Sure, you bet. So everything's printed, offset printed is in 4 colors. We print 4 colors: yellow, magenta, cyan, and black. Okay, those are the actual ink colors. Okay, they're the ink colors, the physical ink that goes from the press to paper. Monitors, everything is RGB in monitors, which means red, green, blue. It's light that's thrown at you versus reflective color. If you're looking at something printed, you're looking at the colors that are on the paper and they reflect back to you. So you see the colors because they reflect back to you. What RGB is, it's a monitor mode. It literally means red, green, and blue. That's the physical colors of every monitor. So what we have to do is we translate RGB into CMYK. The difficulty is, especially probably with a lot of your projects, I bet you have a lot that come out muddy.
They do.
The
they
colors
look
come out muddy.
And just dull. And
they look dull and they look muddy. The reason being is this diagram shows it pretty good. This diagram, color spaces are individual things. There's RGB, there's CMYK, there's LAB, but they're all related. They all have a connection to them. CMYK is what we print. This line here, this is approximate, represents, so inside this triangle is every color that CMYK can produce. It's obviously much more, but this is shrinking down, showing it. You'll see CMYK is notoriously weak in blue. Look at all the blue outside of the printable spectrum. So what happens is we have this CMYK. So everything we do in RGB, this outline here, that has to be squished down into this to make it work. Because when you convert from RGB to CMYK in Photoshop, if the color doesn't convert to CMYK, Photoshop has to do something with it. It has to convert it somehow so it gets it as close as it can.
Mm-hmm.
That's why things turn out money. Things that are super saturated on your monitor will look dull printed. That's just the way it works, just because we're squashing all of this color. So we're trying to, you might pick this color for somebody's cape or their whatever, but you're only ever gonna get this. That's the most you're gonna get.
Yeah.
So we just go, you just try to get it as close as you can. So the color spaces are very important to learn color correction. So if you look, we have cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Red, green, and blue. These colors are opposite of each other. So in color correction, it sounds complex and crazy, but if something's too blue, I need to make it more yellow, not less blue. If the grass is too green, I need to make it more magenta, not less green. So that's how I color correct. So I'll take a photo, I'll fish around in it, and I'll look at all the colors and I'll see if there's anything that's out of gamut. If there's anything that's out here, I'll try to bring it closer before I convert it to CMYK. So that's what we deal with mostly. LAB is the most colorful, powerful color space on Earth. It's literally everything. Every color you can see, every color you can print, colors you can't see, impossible colors. So what LAB does is completely separates contrast from color. So I can work on the contrast in a photo and never affect the color. If you work in RGB or CMYK, you're affecting both the color and the contrast. Not the case with LAB. If you know how to use LAB, you can work on the contrast and then work on the color separately, but it is extremely dangerous. I rarely color correct in LAB because it's wild. If you figure if you're talking, RGB or CMYK, RGB, LAB's this whole room. So it's a wild color space. So if I move color a little bit in LAB, it's a huge move to your eyes. Visually, it's a huge move. So all those different color spaces, they're important to know. And one of the main things that I can tell you guys, and it'll help you out tremendously. Okay, so what I'm going to do with this picture here, you work in Photoshop, correct? All your stuff. Okay, so I'm just going to make this thing nuts. Okay, so I whack that saturation. Okay, this is something that I don't know if you guys know about. Color pickers. You know about these? I'm not sure if you guys know about those things or not. So, what you can do, what I would recommend, how everybody should work, if you're doing comic book stuff and you're working in RGB and converting to CMYK, you can have 2 readers in Photoshop, okay? You can set them to whatever color space you want. You can set this first one to RGB because you're working in RGB. Then you can set your second one to CMYK. The reason you would do that, okay, as I fish around in here, you can see all these colors are coming up and they're fine. There's no exclamation point, there's no warning saying they're out of gamut. When I jack this way up like this, it's obviously insane color, right? See this? look real close on that.
Oh yeah.
See that exclamation point?
Yep.
Okay.
Can you see that from there?
Yeah.
Then get in there.
You guys should work like this. Set your first dropper to RGB. Now those are the colors that you'll be picking for your outfits and whatever. What CMYK is going to do, the reason you want to set your second eyedropper CMYK is that's going to tell you if that color is out of gamut. It's going to tell you that no, it's not going to print right. It's going to look muddy. So take this tool. Another thing you have to make sure you do. Okay. See the exclamation point? See, you could call this color out in RGB, and you'd think this looks great for some flames or some whatever. I mean, it might look fantastic. And it does, but it's not going to translate to the paper. It's not going to print. That's the problem, okay? So use this. Anytime you see this exclamation point here in CMYK, it's not going to print. So as we bring the saturation down, see, it's a little out. It's a little out. It's still out. That's good. So you can just come in and you can play with it, and you can go into individual colors. Make the reds more saturated, less saturated. But the key is having this and watching for that exclamation point. Anytime you see that exclamation point, you know your bright blues aren't going to be bright blue anymore. They're going to be whatever Photoshop's going to get it as close as it possibly can.
So how do they still get those bright blues really printed?
You have to print with different inks. There are a million different inks you can use. So the bright fluorescent inks, you see real bright fluorescent products printed, they're using extra ink. So when they run it through a press, they'll run it through CMYK, and then they'll use a spot color. Then they'll use a UV ink, they'll use another kind of ink. So it becomes a 5-color job, and the price goes through the moon. So anytime you see that stuff printed, it has all those real bright products and colors that are obviously out of CMYK. They're using a spot color, so it's a 5-color job. I did jobs that were 10, 12-color jobs back in the day that used different spot colors and CMYK and a varnish and a tinted varnish, all these different colors. So that's why it's a cost thing. It's a cost thing to print if you wanted to print those comic books and get all those crazy colors, you'd quadruple your cost at least printing them. So that's why CMYK is the easiest common denominator. That's the point. Yeah. And so Photoshop, I did this before Photoshop. Glad I saved these pictures. So I ran what was called a drum scanner. This was film back in the day. This was Photoshop. All it was were dials and knobs. I had 4 numbers to look at to identify a color. So when I started correcting color, I never got to see it until it was printed, until it was proofed. I never knew what it would look like until it was proofed. So that was, there's a million different dials and adjustments on here. This is where I would adjust the contrast, the color, the sharpness, everything got adjusted through these knobs right here. The problem was, the product was hell. It was all in German. Hell was the name of the company. So all these symbols were in German. All the writing was in German. That didn't help. Okay, so this thing was ran by, this thing was a computer. It was probably this big, and it had a 5.5-inch floppy disk that I would put in. That would boot everything. That would start everything up. And I think it was, I want to say it was 5 meg was what that floppy disk, and that was big. I mean, this is 5.5-inch floppies. This is before small floppies. Mm-hmm. They all used to be big 5.5-inch things like that. So that was actually the computer that thing ran on. This was a fiber optic machine. I used to load film onto this side, and it was dark film. had to be loaded in complete darkness, not red lights, not anything. So we actually had to practice. I had to practice and practice and practice. We had pieces of film that were already exposed that we could practice mounting it in pitch blackness. You had to mount everything in pitch blackness. It would get imaged in blackness, processed in blackness. Then we would have to make a proof. So back then, if you had an 8.5, 11 page, just one page for your magazine, we would have to output 4 pieces of film. Then we would have to make a color proof, and it would cost about $100. If you wanted to see what your page looked like in color, it cost about $100. That's what it used to cost. Now, you spit out a color copy that costs a half a cent.
Yeah.
Yeah, if that, yep. So this is Photoshop before Photoshop.
Oh man.
That was a couple years ago.
Nightmarish.
What kind of got you into learning that? I mean,
Learning
you
color?
know, learning more of the new technology to go along with
I didn't have a choice. I had no choice. When I started, it was all film. And so one of the companies I worked for back east before I moved out here, stuff was starting to go electronics, starting to go. We had old, I don't know what they were called, DOS, whatever computers they were. I ran a step and repeat system where I had to type in 10 dot run 20 dot this dot this and then all for 5 minutes to have a machine go and that would be it. So this stuff was moving that way and I knew it. I was young, I loved it, couldn't get enough of it, and I wanted to stay in it. So I had to start learning computers. I was hated. I was the one that they threw in the computer room. I had all these old guys, 50, 60-year-old guys, and they were calling me a craftsman killer. They were like, "You're going to take our job. That machine can do the job of 4 of us in one day." And I said, "What choice do I have? You guys are retiring in 5 years. If I want to stay with the industry, I have to go with the technology."
Yeah.
So I literally, I was in printing when it went from film to electronics. So I learned on the fly. I actually learned. You know, nobody really knew what the heck we were doing. When we went into electronics, the first Quark program was a nightmare to work in, absolute nightmare. Photoshop, first Photoshops, there were no layers, there wasn't anything. I mean, it was unbelievable. You would click, and your computer, man, just to make a move in a curve, it would take a minute and a half.
I honestly
2
don't know
minutes.
how I would do it without layers. Honestly.
Yeah, well, we did it without layers. Yeah.
Oh man.
And with all this film too, the print shops I worked in, they literally ran 24/7, 365. They had to.
Yeah.
They had to. I do the work. I was just talking to a gentleman I worked with probably 25 years ago. I literally do the work of 5 pre-press guys working 5 days a week. I do that amount of work in probably an hour and a half. Would have taken 5 full-time employees, 40 hours, 200 man hours, whatever to do that amount of work.
I mean, I've seen the old videos where they're all trying to adjust the kerning and everything, and that just looked like a nightmare. The funny thing is, in all those videos that I've seen, it's so loud.
Everything was loud.
I mean, you know, here it's pretty quiet compared to
Everything
what
was
that
loud.
was. And you even had, like, in the videos, there was always those sign language interpreters.
Yes.
Was that really that big of a problem?
Yes. Yeah. That's why I can't hear. That's why a lot of printers can't hear because of that. Yeah. You got Ron. You got to tell Ron something 6 times because he just can't hear anymore.
I tried to tell him something once.
Yeah. It's just because you can't. Yeah. It was that big of a problem. That and the chemistry that we used was the developer was lethal. It was nasty stuff.
How you guys all didn't end up, completely deaf with cancer,
It's coming, maybe. Who knows, right? But I know that stuff we used. Everything we used, the chemistry we used here, and to develop film, it's literally illegal. You're not allowed to use any of it anymore. It's been outlawed. We used to have to take developer. So we would take developer, and we had big drums about this big, and they were packed with I can't remember what was in there. Anyways, it was called a silver recovery unit because film was all silver. That's what film was made from, was silver. So what we used to do after the film was done, after the film was used up, we would take the chemistry that had the silver leached out of it, we would dump it into these big barrels, and about once a month, a guy would come and he would collect. It would, the silver would attach itself to these magnetic plates that were in this big bucket. And they would chip the silver off, and they would take it and recycle it and make new film out of it. Go over and over and over. But everybody had those silver recovery units. You weren't allowed to dump that chemistry down the drain. Even back then, they wouldn't even let you put it in the sewer. It was so nasty.
Man.
So we didn't have gloves. I think about that. I'm like, oh my God, I never wore gloves. I never wore any of that stuff. So, yeah, it was quite a different story then. That's for sure. So.
Could have ended up with a third arm and
Absolutely. Yep.
ended up a comic character yourself.
Yep, no doubt. Yep. Well, here's how, if you were doing a comic book back then, this is how you would do your type. You were talking about the metal type.
Mm-hmm.
Proofreading marks. These are all manuals that I actually learned from. It was quite a different story back then.
So a lot of times with when you're looking at those old comic book pages, not the ones that were actually printed, but the ones, the proofs and stuff like that, there was all these numbers written in the, for different colors and stuff.
Yes.
What was that? Like, is it just one flat color and that was it? Or
No, what that was is I'll show you. Okay, so this is what you're referring to.
Yes.
Okay, so what that is you as an artist, you would have a black and white image. You would just have this, okay? So in your mind, you would have to think, what colors do you want these things to be? What exactly, is she wearing blue jeans, black jeans, green jeans, whatever. So what you would do is you would go to a color chart and you would find the blue that you liked, the green that you liked. What these numbers represent is, so you liked her shirt to be a lighter blue. So what this means 60% cyan. This means this leaf here is going to be green. It's going to be 50% yellow, 50% magenta. Same thing with this. So what you would do as the artist, you would draw these in there. And you would say, I want this, I want this, I want this, and I want this color, I want that color. So, it took a long, long time just to figure out what colors you would want, okay? Then you would send this with a sheet over top of it, and these numbers written on there, with arrows. You would send them to me. What I would do is I literally had to go in there and cut these out by hand
We were talking
on a
razor
piece
blade.
of rube. Yeah, a
Talking
razor
knife.
blade.
Oh.
And the red sheet that we saw earlier, Ruby Lith. So this is one sheet. You would cut and have to peel off these things. So this was all done by hand.
So how would you handle something like a gradient?
You'd have to use a screen. You would have to use a screen. You would get here's that screen finder I told you about. So here's a screen. It was literally a piece of film. You would have to take. We would have big boxes of film that I had all kind of percentages of screens. I had 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, 30%. And that's where I would have to cut little pieces of that screen and match it up to this, if that makes sense.
So essentially, the more colors, the more you want to kill the artist.
Yeah, the more you want to kill the artist. Exactly, yeah. Yep. So that's why, and so those screens would come in the gradients. So we would have a piece of screen. It was literally a piece of film, and the entire piece of film was exactly 10%, okay?
Okay.
But we would have gradient films. So we would have a piece of film that was made on a drum scanner like I showed you, like I ran, that would go from 0, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so it would get darker, 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 darker. So if you wanted a gradient, you just had to figure out which gradient you want. Then I had to cut a piece of that film, put it behind there, make sure the gradient was correct. Everything was by hand. Everything was by hand. When we went to computers, I always thought it was cheating. I always thought I was paid for my hands and my eyes. It was everything had to be done manually back then.
In the early days of comics, there really wasn't that much gradient at all.
Right.
It was all
That's why.
like
DMS
still
colors.
shading, so it's just one simple thing.
Yep.
That was it. No.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's why. That's why it would have been very expensive. Very expensive to do that. So, yep, all these different manuals. This is how I learned. Went through a year apprenticeship. My wife has been in printing her entire career. She started in 1975 in printing $1.17 an hour. I think it was $1.17 or $1.18 an hour. She's part-time. She started part-time in a paste up department, so doing paste up. And I started not long after her. I started at $3.15 an hour. I worked in a press room for $3.15 an hour, so it made about $24 a day for an 8-hour shift. Is all it was.
At the time, was it worth it?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it was worth it. Back then. Back then, well, we rented a duplex. It was $150 a month.
Oh.
So it wasn't expensive back then. Yeah. So my wife was in printing for 25 years, 30 years, and so that's actually how I met her. I met her in a print shop. And my father, like I had said, worked at Westinghouse Printing, which was the biggest company in the world. He started setting hot metal type in the 1950s and literally retired as the general manager of the entire corporation. Literally worked his way from the bottom to the top. He worked for Westinghouse forever and a day. So.
Well, with all of that experience, you got to have some stories.
Okay, so annual reports were a big deal back then. The high-end printers, you wanted to get all the big corporations' annual reports. That was the big deal. Okay, so my dad, they got this one. It was one of the biggest annual reports I've ever done. It was one of the most important jobs he's ever done in his entire career. So they get this job all printed, and it's perfect bound, meaning that
There's no staples.
there's no staples, so it was glued together. Okay. The problem was it was a big thick book. Okay. The problem is the glue didn't take. So they have this thing all done. It's all printed, and they go to open it up and it starts falling apart. And so my dad says millions and millions of dollars. He's like, this is it. I'm done. They're firing. There's no way they're going to accept a $2 million mistake, even though he was the manager. They all took the fall, not the binder. The big guy takes the fall. So he didn't know what the heck to do. He had this big book. It was due, and so he had connections all over the country printing. So he went up to New York and talked to an old bindery hack, is what they used to call it. If you were a bindery hack, that was a compliment. That meant you were a journeyman bindery guy. You could do all kind of stuff. So if you were called a hack, you were very, very good at your job, which
Very
kind of
different
seems,
now.
yeah,
You're a
kind of
hack.
seems opposite. Yeah. So my dad calls him and he says, I'm dead. You got to save me. And he says, well, bring me some books. So my dad literally got on a plane, took some books to New York, went to this guy's bindery. It was a huge bindery in Brooklyn. I think they had 400 people working just in the bindery at one time. Yeah.
Wow.
So the guy looks at this book, looks at the covers, and he says, so your covers aren't sealed yet? And he says, no, because everything was falling apart. We didn't finish the covers. So the guy looks at it, he stacks them up, and they start falling apart, they start falling out. He just looks at it. He gets somebody he said, squeeze this. He gets somebody to squeeze it real tight. The guy took a sponge and he wet the glue, just by hand, wet the glue until it got real gummy. Then he took that cover and he slapped it on it by hand. And he just held it. Damn if it didn't hold. So My dad says, "You mean we got to do that then? 50,000 of these books?" The guy says, "Yeah, if you want them to work, that's what you got to do." So my
I
dad,
love that just simple answer.
yep, my dad went back there, and they literally had tables and tables of people lined up 24 hours a day, sitting there holding magazines, taking a sponge, wetting that glue, making sure it didn't run over, it was too wet, slapping covers on, and boom, but it saved his job.
So why did the glue work that time?
It wasn't wet enough. So when they went to bind it originally, the glue wasn't mixed right. It didn't adhere. It didn't have enough water in it, so it wasn't sticking like it should have. That's what the binder guy said. He said your glue was all messed up, man. That was the problem. So yeah, he was able to figure that out just by looking at that. My dad knows more about printing, and he had guys that knew more about printing. Nobody could figure this out except this one guy. Yeah, except this one guy. So that's how we did things. And here's another interesting story. I worked for a printer in Pittsburgh, high quality print shop, and we printed all of the Pittsburgh Penguins, the hockey team, NHL hockey team. We printed all of the programs for the games every night. Would have to print that, do the lineup changes. It'd be the last second every night. We'd run those things down there and would get them to the arena just in time.
This is before it blew up like it is now.
Yeah, before hockey.
Yeah.
Before hockey blew up. This was in late 80s, early 90s. So there were only 21 teams in the NHL, and 7 of them were in Canada. So it was super cult sport. So we printed all the magazines, these goal magazines, and we printed their programs, all that kind of stuff. So in the Penguins, my team were horrible. They were the laughing stock of the NHL. They drafted a savior in 1994 named Mario Lemieux, and they got better and better and better. And so we were printing all their programs, and lo and behold, May 25th, 1991, my beloved Penguins won the Stanley Cup for the first time. So they won the Stanley Cup. We get caught. This is a Saturday night in Minnesota. So they win the Stanley Cup. Of course, we're all, we've had maybe 2 beers, something like that. We were hammered.
Okay.
Saturday night, we start getting calls. This is phones. Like, you never didn't pick up your home phone. Ever. So we start getting calls. We're all just kind of groggy. Like 2 o'clock in the morning. Get a call. It's work. They're like, you got to get in here and make plates. They said, we're supposed to print 400,000 posters, and we have to have them ready for the parade by Tuesday morning. We were like, holy hell, how are we going to do this? So we get, everybody's hammered. Somehow we get to work. We're there, and the problem was, it was all film. There was no electronics, no anything. So our photographer, who had taken the pictures in Minnesota a couple hours earlier, flew back to Pittsburgh. There was a 5-mile traffic jam to get to the airport when the Penguins came home. It was the biggest celebration on the planet. So he's stuck. We can't get there. We can't get the film to our plant, to develop it, make the separations, strip it so I can make the plates.
Mm-hmm.
Honest to God, they hired a helicopter. They went to the airport and they said, look, we've got to get this film. They gave clearance for a helicopter to land on the tarmac. The helicopter landed on the tarmac, got the film, literally landed on the top of our building, downtown Pittsburgh, landed on top of our building, did the film. I want to say I worked 22 straight hours from the time I went in there. And sure enough, we got all these posters printed for the parade. They have the parade. The day later, they bring the Stanley Cup to our office. I'll show you a picture. They actually bring the Stanley Cup to our office, and they just drop it off. They're like, we'll be back in a couple hours. This is at 7 o'clock in the morning. We're like, okay. So somebody went and got a bunch of champagne, bunch of Dom Perignon champagne. And that you couldn't get near that cup today. They just dropped it off and left it, and they said, we'll be back in a few hours. But the guys that I worked with, oh, that's me stripping. But
Different kind of stripping.
yeah, different kind of stripping. It was called stripping. Film. That's what it was called. When I showed you the layout and stuff on a light table, it was actually called stripping. When I applied for jobs when I first came out here, I would look in the one ads in a newspaper. They had one ads. That's how I used to have to get a job. It would be 4-color stripper, 2-color stripper, journeyman stripper. That was the industry term. So. These are some of the old plate burners I told you about. With the sodium halide lights, we had to close these curtains because it would blind you, literally blind you. So we would hit the button to expose something and there'd just be blue light glowing out of it like Frankenstein.
So blind you, make you deaf.
Yep. This was the 10 dot run. I can't remember what it was called. This was
DOS computer.
unbelievably powerful computer. They paid so much money for this, it was ridiculous. And now it's a big press room. Yep. So I ended up drinking champagne out of the Stanley Cup because of where I worked.
I love it.
Pretty cool, huh?
That is.
Pretty cool. Yeah, I've loved it. I've never worked a day in my life. It's so fun. Just so fun. We actually had guys that we used to print daily newspapers, and there would be a truck. We did some from West Virginia as well as Pittsburgh. We were right on the border there.
Mm-hmm.
We had a big truck driver. His name was Tubby. Tubby. I mean, you see the guy. He's Tubby. There's no question about it. Everybody called him Tubby. That was his
I
name.
love when they just lean into their attributes.
Oh, he loved it. He loved it. So he used to drive these newspapers down to West Virginia. One day he came, 2 things happened to him. He was driving back one day and he hit a deer with a big truck, a big delivery truck. And he stopped and looked and couldn't find what was up under the wheel well. He brought the deer back. We strung it up on the dock, butchered it. Everybody took some meat home. And then about 2 weeks later, Tubby drove some newspapers down, and he went to go to the bathroom, and it was one of those toilets that was attached to the wall.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Tubby sat on the toilet, and it didn't stay attached to the wall. And she literally got blown out of the stall from the pressure of the water. Yeah, it was interesting. Everybody smoked. Everybody smoked while you worked. It was just totally different time.
Yeah, on those videos that I was watching, it seemed like you couldn't see about 3 desks down because of all the smoke in the air.
Yeah.
Whether it was from the plate burners or
Yep.
you guys.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah, it was. I'm sure. Yeah, it was a combination of all of it. Yeah, I used to work with a guy named Bill. He worked second shift, and he would come in every day. He smoked a freaking stogie. It was that big. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was like one of them Churchill stogies, and you'd smell them before you saw them. He'd walk into the pre-press room. There'd be this cloud of smoke, and it'd just, greetings. You'd just sit down and start working.
With all the chemicals, the cancer, all that stuff, how did you guys even make it to retirement?
I don't know.
Let's face it.
I don't know how we made it. I don't know how we got anything done. And people ask me, how did you get anything done? I'm like, well, we didn't have any other choice. Because we didn't have any other options. That was just how you had to do it.
Mhm.
That's the reason print shops, every print shop I ever knew until the mid-90s ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just because it took that long to put something together.
Yeah, I love it in those videos where, your shift ends, somebody else is coming, tapping you on the shoulder, they sit down, go straight to work. There was no delay.
They didn't have
There was
locks
no,
on the
like,
doors.
hey, what's going on here?
Yeah.
It was just,
Yep.
you sat down, you knew what was going on.
Everything was done, when you worked for a company back there, everything was done exactly the same. Those negatives that I showed you, they had
Mhm.
writing on them, they had labels. Everybody labeled everything the exact same way for that reason. Somebody could come in and just take over a job. There wouldn't be, what did you do here? What did you do there? You could just see what they did. So I used to do a lot of photo retouching, color correction. So people would bring me things like this. This is actually a picture of my aunt, one of my dad's sisters in the 1950s. So I scanned this, and it has writing in it and all that stuff. So I went into Photoshop, and so through the magic of Photoshop, I created that. So that's what I started with. That's the final product. So I put the color in there, I did everything. I actually went back and researched the colors of the day, and I actually went in there and colorized that photo because there's no color, obviously, black and white. So I did a lot of that type of thing. Another thing I did a lot of, and this was so fun, this is really cool. This is a professional shot by one of the best photographers on earth. For Snow West magazine many years ago, it's an incredible shot. The scenery's amazing. But I look at a photo, and it's very rare that I don't see 100 problems with every photo, because a camera does strange things to pictures and colors. They never appear as you see them. How many times have you taken a photo and say, God, it didn't look like that? Because the camera has to go with all that information, right? So I look at this photo and I'm like, God, there's everything I need to make this photo phenomenal. I didn't add anything. I didn't clone anything. I used what was here, and I went in LAB and I adjusted the contrast, and I just wailed on this thing to look at it. So when you're looking at it, my idea of color correction is, what did it look like when you were standing there? Not what it looks like, not what the camera gave us. What did it actually look like when you were standing there? And that's how I corrected. So, if you want to zoom in on this, watch, I'll just slowly, and again, no cloning, no anything. That's the original. That's 25% of my correction. That's half of my correction. That's the whole correction. Look at the difference in the detail. That's what it looked like when you were standing there. That's what it looked like. It didn't look muddy. It didn't look like that. It had, see how it looks like it's all flat? When you look here, it's not. It's not, because cameras they've never been good at contrast. That's what it looked like when you were standing there. When I showed this photo to them, they were like, how did you do that? I'm like, that's why you pay me. They were absolutely floored. They had no idea that photo looked that good. So I've done, lots of those things. This is another cool shot. This was off the coast of San Diego. One of our shooters shot these seals down here, and I looked at it again. Anytime I see a photo that is very bland, very flat with color and contrast, because I know how to use it, I just go right to LAB. This screams LAB to me. And I've done it so often that we actually did a little video on it. I don't know if they still have it or not, but I can see the correction before I do it. Like, I'll look at the picture and I'll say, okay, I'm going to adjust the curve here and the contrast here and this here. I do the correction in my head, then I do it in Photoshop. So I actually do it ahead of time. So what I did with this, I'm like, God, that doesn't look anything like that. That's what it looked like. When you were standing up on that cliff looking down at them, it didn't look like that. That's what it looked like. Again, I didn't add anything. I didn't take anything away. I took what was there and I maximized. That's why it's never, ever, ever, ever a fair fight for the best photographer in the world versus a skilled Photoshop operator. There's not a photo on the planet that I can't improve. Not one. Not one. It's just not a fair fight. I have tools that a camera doesn't. A camera can't see things correctly. It can't interpret what's there correctly. They just fall flat.
So what I am going to do is show you how to make a printing plate. I've got the file already set up. Now I am just going to send it to my plate maker.
So what is a printing plate?
So what a printing plate is it's actually a big sheet of aluminum. And we image things onto the sheet of aluminum. The aluminum is wrapped around a cylinder on a printing press. Paper hits the aluminum, hits a rubber blanket, and it transfers the image to the paper. So the printing plate is a transfer method. It's an in-between method, actually, is what it is. It
gets it from the electronics to the paper, is what the plate is. And they're made out of aluminum. Our plates, we use a negative plate, which means, you'll see in a minute, it wraps around the cylinder, and what happens is there's a laser in there that blasts away the background. So it's not imaging what we want to see, it's getting rid of what we don't want to see and what we don't want to print. So I'll just release this plate, and that's going to send it over to this machine here, which is actually, there's a laser inside of here that actually blasts away that background. So I have my plates in a drawer over here. So they're aluminum, they're pliable. I have to line them up exactly on these lines. Okay, so now what it's doing is it'll suck the plate in, it'll wrap it around a cylinder. Once it wraps around the cylinder, we'll hear it start to spin. It'll make a noise. It spins like a dryer, 1,000,000 miles an hour. And as it spins, there's a laser inside there that's just blasting everything away. But now it's lining everything up. It's feeding the information. There's information that it fed to this machine as far as the sheet size, where the layout's going to be, where the thing's actually going to be on the sheet. This job in particular is tricky because it's what's called a kit cover, so a folder that you open up and you put papers in. So we print those flat. They have to be laid out just right every time. So you'll hear this thing start to spin. You hear those little clicks. It's wrapping it around a cylinder now. Those little clicks are actually punches. You'll see them when they come out. So there's a punch bar that aligns from here to this punch to our big press out there. So right now that thing is just spinning, just imaging, and it'll show you up here how far along we are. So now it's just measuring, it's lining it all up. Now it's preparing it. It's actually showing the cylinder starting to spin.
Now this only does one color at a time, so the
Correct.
CMYs can.
Yeah, this job in particular is just one color, it's just black. If it was a 4-color job, we'd have to do this 4 times and get 4 plates for it. But now it's actually recording. So right now the laser's actually blasting away inside there. Once it's done, it'll automatically feed onto this conveyor belt. This is the developer. So what will happen is it feeds on this conveyor belt, the plate will get sucked down into here. Underneath here is developer. That's just a developer that takes away the images that we don't want on the plate. Then it'll come up through here, it'll come through these rollers, it'll go across this brush and it gets anything off of there that was left over. Then it comes back here, and this last roller puts what's called a gum on it. What the gum does is it lets the water and the paper and the plates play nice, basically is what it's for. That's a short way to put it. So you'll see once this thing's done imaging, it'll come through here, get sucked down in here. All of this stuff I used to do by hand. I used to have to hand develop plates, rub them with the developer, then actually rub a gum on them, and we had we called them pizza trays. So they were huge racks that we would do plate by plate because we had to dry each plate one by one. So now you can hear it winding down. You'll see right here, it'll come out of here, and there's little tricks that tell this conveyor belt when to go. So it's unwinding it, unloading the plate. You might be able to see a little bit of image on here, but I doubt it since there's not a lot of type. Yeah, you can't really see much image on there yet. So where you'll see it is, once it gets sucked down into here, and it starts to come up through these rollers, you'll see all of that blue stuff is going to be gone, and then just what we want to print is going to be left on that plate. So that's water that just washes everything off. See how it's not blue? And you'll get to see a little bit of image somewhere here. See it? Right there. Now, when it comes out here, it puts the gum on last. Then there's dryers. So now I look at it and I make sure everything looks okay. All the type is there, it's not cut off. Now I take this plate. These punches were put on, these ones were put on inside that machine. Everything collates from that machine to this punch to our big press. So now what I do is I punch this plate for the pressman. So now there's more holes in there. We will take this out to the press room. The pressman will flip it around and put another set of punches on it. Then he'll mount it onto the press and get going with it.
Cool.
I'd like to thank you.
Oh, of course, man. Yeah, my pleasure, man. Enjoy working with it.
Let's do this.
Go in.
All right. Well, thanks again.
You bet, man. Thank you.